This is a quick, hopefully quick video that I've recorded of a session that I did at the EUC Forum a couple of days ago, and it's about Windows profiles and whether we should still care about managing them. So without further ado, we shall press on with it. So before we dive in, right, let's give a bit of background about profiles and how we got to the current state of affairs where we are profiles wise, right? So what is the Windows user profile, right? Well, essentially, and we're talking just about Windows here, right? Not about Linux. That's a big can of worms. The user profile is what ties the 2 or 3 major parts of your user personality together, right? Apps and data and config, and it's a vital part of your user experience. And it contains things like, not necessarily data as in documents and things like that, but things like view settings, display settings, shortcuts, wallpapers, screensavers, color schemes, config items, dictionaries, auto text files, signatures, MRU lists, history, blah, 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 blah. Not raw business data and docs, not applications, all of these things that knit together all of those other bits into what you would consider user experience, right? Now, why is the user profile significant, right? I did a Windows 10 migration for 19,000 users quite a while ago now, actually, and I did a breakdown of all the service desk calls that we had as part of the migration. As you can see, speed of logon, file type associations, view settings, 41% of the support calls during that Windows 10 migration were related to user profile issues, right? So the profile is quite important, although maybe, which we'll get to in a bit, maybe not as important as it used to be, but certainly vital for a user experience. Now, if you're as old as me and you've ever worked on Windows 3.11, there was no such thing as a user profile, right? And if you were like me at the time, I worked at a cheese factory and I had a sharing machine with another user. I had it in the use of it in the morning, they had it in the afternoon, and being a young lad at the time, I would change the colour scheme to things like this, the infamous hot dog colour scheme. So poor Linda, who had a sharing machine with me in the afternoon, probably absolutely hated me. So that's why with Windows NT 3.1 and 4, they produced the concept of a user profile, right? So each user who logged onto the machine, was authenticated, would get their own various bits. I've called out here a few of the bits that are in there. I mean, this is from Windows NT, right, so very, very old. But the basic building blocks, although they've moved around a bit, have remained the same. You've got the, the file system entries that sit wherever they sit now. You've got the HK current user registry hive, which is ntuser.dat, which is in the root. You've got transaction logs, shared settings, and an environment variable as well. So that's where we got the concept of a user profile come along. Now on Windows, there are 4 different types of profiles, maybe more if you believe some third-party hype. But anyway, you've got a local profile, which is stored only on the device. So each user logging onto a Windows endpoint gets a local profile that's local to the device. Obviously, if you then roam from device to device, you have to create a new profile from scratch. There's also a roaming profile, which is stored on a file server share and then comes down to the device at log on and back to the share at log off, which is defined in AD or group policy. Got a mandatory profile, which is a roaming profile that's not saved back to the file share when you log out, right? So you can't persist profile changes, you always receive the same profile settings. That's ideal for kiosks and things like that. And there's also a temporary profile. If there's a problem with the user profile, the system will create you a temporary profile at log off, and like a mandatory profile, it'll be discarded when you log back out. Now, as operating systems move onwards, there are different versions of profiles, right? So the latest version that we have is a version 6 profile. It's been around since Windows 10 1607. But if you go back and look at that picture there, you can see all the different operating systems the different profiles apply to. Now, normally if you take a profile from an older operating system and log on to a new one, it will do a one-time upgrade. But if you then try and go back to the older operating system, you'll see some problems. So each of these profile types are independent of the operating system, depending on the mechanics going on behind the scenes. Now, we mentioned roaming profiles, right? So the idea of the roaming profile is you would have a non-persistent system. A user would come along, log on to the system. When they're logged on, their profile will be copied down from a file share. When their session finished and they're logged out, it's then copied back to the file share. Again, right? A nice, easy way of allowing users to roam around between devices. However, as many of you probably know, there are obvious drawbacks. Large files, and particularly large numbers of small files, cause them lots of issues. They're very detrimental to performance. So you want to break a machine rather spectacularly, right? Create about 10,000 1 kilobyte files inside a roaming profile share, and then try and log on. I can pretty much guarantee your log on will never succeed. Roaming profiles also only capture the app data roaming folder. They ignore any other folders in there, which often a lot of modern software writes to. You can hack around that, but it's messy, it's unsupported. So roaming profiles, simple solution for the problem we had, but they had a lot of issues themselves. So what a lot of people did was, right, they adopted folder redirection. So instead of copying all those files in and out from those busy areas, right, instead during the session, certain folders like documents, like desktop, like app data, things like that, will be redirected to a UNC share, right? And that got around the problems of log on and log off that we had associated with roaming profiles. However, they also introduced problems of their own, right? They often, obviously if the network share went offline, you'd have some issues, that's the major problem. But you also had impacts on application performance and session reliability and things like that. Even today, right, on high performance SMB shares, if you redirect the desktop, for instance, in a virtual desktop environment, you may see some drag, right? So got rid of one problem, introduced some more. So if you're familiar with profile management, we then got things like Ivanti UWM, which was called AppSense at the time, things like Res, things like Sense, things like that, right? Quite a lot of software in this. And these appeared in a lot of serious deployments trying to solve those issues of folder redirection and roaming profiles, right? So instead of having everything done at log on and log off backed by redirected folders, all of the settings for each application or the operating system, when they were needed, they were injected into the session from an SQL database stream via HTTPS, right? And these avoided a lot of the issues with application instability and session performance. They ran great. However, this also had its drawbacks, right? So you can see from that diagram there that it looks pretty complicated. It was very, very complicated. It also had a cost attached to it. You need a lot of maintenance, a lot of resource to keep it running. It was very difficult to quickly onboard things. Often you had to define every single application with its file system and its registry entries and things like that. And it just involved a lot of maintenance. Things that normally would go to first and second line support ended up going to third and fourth line support. So a lot of cost, a lot of complexity, a lot of time and resource management being invested into these solutions. Great as they were, right? Very efficient. Written well, they'd be great, but configured badly, you'd probably have lots and lots of issues as you moved on. So about 2013-ish, bearing in mind this kind of Ivanti based sort of solutions we were seeing a lot of, along came FS Logics and brought a kind of revolutionary method of profile management. And they took an old Microsoft feature called user profile disks, right? They put a bit of filter driver and a bit of secret sauce on top of it and came up with a solution called profile containers. And the concept was simply that the entire user profile was mounted to a network location, but not as an SMB share, not directly putting files into an SMB share, but placing in there a VHD or VHDX virtual disk, which is then mounted, right? So that entire user profile was now mounted as a single file, which the operating system saw as local storage, right? It thought it was just a C drive. So you avoid those log on and log off issues, right? A 30 megabyte VHD would be mounted in exactly the same time as a 300 gigabyte VHD. You can use it in conjunction with redirected folders, or alternatively you could get rid of them entirely. Single file mount made sure that performance would be good. But the big draw was the ease of use, right? You simply capture that entire user profile into a single file and then attach it to any session. Very low maintenance, very little management. They even came out with a cut down version called Office Container, which brought that benefits of VHD mounting to OST files, Teams, caches, OneDrive caches, things like that. So if you're already using something like Ivanti, you could benefit from the concept just by bolting it on. And it became really, really popular to the extent where it was, as you probably know, purchased by Microsoft to replace user profile disk. However, when things get popular, you eventually find the drawbacks and limitations. FS Logic's profiles were specific to the profile version. You can't share them across operating systems. They use tons of storage by design because they captured the entire profile, and if you're running a cloud hyperscaler, they could become very expensive. They're always very sensitive to any latency to the file share, right? Anything over 3 milliseconds resulted in very poor performance. They were never the best for published app environments or environments where users used multiple sessions, right? Because you need exclusive access to virtual disk, and you ended up putting fudges in like differencing disks and then merging them back into the base. Replication for DR could be troublesome as well, and if you wanted to keep a local copy of the profile to work in offline scenarios or network outage scenarios, you didn't have an option. You had a feature called Cloud Cache, which you could do it with, but since Microsoft purchased it, I think they really haven't taken Cloud Cache forward to where it was intended to be. So anyway, that's kind of where we've arrived at today, right? Where a lot of people have gone container-based and they're finding that there are certain limitations attached to it. But I think it's important to try and stop and think, where is the user profile heading as a concept, right? So Microsoft has started this move away from the user profile towards the model that is used by arguably the most successful application deployment method ever, which is the mobile app system, right? On your mobile device, most user settings are held at the back end, and those that aren't are easily migrated or backed up to the cloud. So nowadays we're starting to see more and more Windows application settings that used to sit inside the Windows user profile moving to cloud back ends. One that's moved very recently is your signatures in Outlook, right? That is now part of Office 365. You don't have to worry about roaming it. You can just log into Office 365 and there it is. So the subscription model is slowly starting to make that Windows user profile more obsolete. And in a number of years, it could quite possibly be gone altogether. But it's not quite there yet, right? So the bigger apps will become self-contained more quickly, and they will do because they want to use subscription models. But we still, for the moment, as admins, consultants, whatever job we do, we'll have to deal with the user profile as a requirement, particularly in larger environments where you've got a lot of diverse applications, a lot of tech debt. I mean, in my job, I deal with desktops, laptops, thin clients, virtual desktops, virtual apps, different Windows operating systems, even users with combinations of all these. How do we manage the profiles across all of these different personas? Now, one thing I do see is people often put down as a requirement in their project that users must have the same user experience replicated across all of their devices. And I've seen it done, right? I've done it myself. Did it myself in a higher education environment. I remember a guy who had his desktop replaced, and when he spun it back up, he was amazed that everything came back exactly where it was before his machine died, right down where his icons were. And that's very cool, and it's a noble goal. But is it practical, or is it even required, right? What if a user has different apps on different machines? For instance, on my machine here, I have Hyper-V Lab on my desktop, and I wouldn't want to log on to my laptop and find all the shortcuts and all the virtual machines associated with that on my laptop, right? They literally wouldn't fit. I mean, what if your main machine has 6 monitors divided into virtual screens and has a GPU, and they log on a virtual desktop from a thin client with 1 screen and no GPU? How do you translate them? So unless you're specifically working with users on identical virtual desktops with very predictable access devices, the idea that you should actually totally replicate the user's profile on every single machine from device to device is pretty pointless. I mean, the user might not even notice, right? But on the flip side, certain aspects of that bit of roaming are very desirable. For instance, when I log into my laptop, I always get the Office 365 most recently used documents, which lets me seamlessly continue working, right? It's good from a productivity perspective. So you need to hit that happy medium. So what you need to do is look at the different user working personas and scenarios, right? Identify what they need from profile management, right? For users with non-persistent virtual desktops, yeah, capture the whole profile, right? Because they need that consistency. Well, if you've got some users who maybe just use virtual apps, then maybe you just need a little bit of profile management, just a few file system and registry settings. What if you've got users with different OSs? How do you manage the profiles there, right? Do you keep it separate? Do you try and synchronize some of the settings? What about persistence? There's loads and loads of ways that you can actually do that, right? So you need to sit down there and understand your user work patterns, understand your application sets, and make a good judgment on what you need in terms of profile management. So, the thrust of this presentation, after we've talked about different requirements, user patterns, is that I think there's a product out there that a lot of people forgot about for Profile Manager. It's Citrix User Profile Manager. Now, for years, I've been a big advocate of FS Logics because I really, really loved it. But since Microsoft have acquired it, the latest release has been a little bit unstable. It broke the roaming of Office authentication, some other functionality, and it's a shame because I've done stacks of great deployments with FS Logics. But UPM, right, a lot of people have forgotten about it. They last used it when it was just a few features ahead of a basic roaming profile. So they're often surprised when they revisit it and they see how far it's come, right? So UPM is not as simple as FS Logics, but it's still pretty simple to configure and set up. The agent that runs it is part of the VDA, so you can install it as part of the VDA, or you can install it on your own. It's driven by policy settings that you can target through AD or Citrix Studio. All you need to get going is an SMB file share, whether that's on premises or in the cloud, doesn't matter. So it's pretty straightforward to get going. One thing worth mentioning though, it is still kind of separate from the VDA here. So you can stay on a downstream VDA version and use a newer UPM version. Just be a little bit careful about how this translates in terms of support. I mean, I recommend going with current release all the way, so to keep your UPM in sync, it's easy enough to do that with the VDA version. Also, it's a Windows product, Citrix UPM. It's not native to Citrix. You can run it on physical Windows machines if you want as well, as long as you've got current Citrix CSS licensing. Now, the big thing that makes UPM so much more worthwhile these days is you can skin it in any way you want to meet your needs. And the main change that makes this possible is that as of version 2009, UPM now does containers just like FSLogix. But unlike FSLogix, UPM since version 2103 also has the capability to keep a local cache of the container, right? Which essentially makes it ideal for scenarios where you need to be resistant to a network outage, right? If you've got an FSLogix profile mounted as a container and the network share goes down, you will suffer some problems inside the user profile. But you now do local container caching in UPM as well. It only works at the minute when it's configured to capture the entire container, the same as FSLogix profile container, but that's certainly an exciting development from UPM. It also, right, as well, has built-in VHDX compaction, right? So for years, people with FSLogix, the problem was when you add files to a container that you're using for a profile, it expands dynamically, right? But then if you delete the files that you've added there, it doesn't compact dynamically. So you could end up with lots of white space within your user profiles. Now it doesn't matter, because it will use the white space first, right? It won't just be left there and grow and grow and grow and grow. But the thing is, if you're in an environment where you're paying for storage by the gigabyte, right, you could be using space you don't need to. So a lot of people used to use scripts that log off to compact. However, now FSLogix has just added this functionality to compact when used log off. Now UPM's added it as well, and it's also added some more flexible conditions. So based around the free space ratio and the number of log offs since it last ran, or even a combination of the two, you can tell it when to do the compaction. I'd like to see some new features added there. Maybe, compact during a specific maintenance window, and Citrix UPM team are quite open to suggestions and quite responsive, so hopefully we'll see some even more granular features in there soon, but it does now have that. Now, even if you're not using containers and you're using UPM in the old way as like file-based rather than container-based, you can still easily handle that network share offline scenario, because you can just configure, you've been able to do this for a very long time, since version 2, you can say just keep me a local copy of the user profile, right? So the idea is, if you've got a user with their profile stored on the machine and with their profile stored in the file share as well, and they sync together as changes are made, if that link is cut, the user will keep on writing changes to the local copy, and when that link comes back up, it'll merge them back together. And we've tested this on some particularly sort of high performance users, and it works great, right? Even when the users have multiple sessions, if that's cut, they will merge them back pretty much seamlessly. So it's really, really good for offline resiliency. I think that's the major advantage that UPM, file-based or container-based, has over FSLogix at the moment. Now, another new feature, which is great, which came along in 2106, is the ability to do replication to multiple stores, right? So normally you just configure a store for UPM to write to, and you had to then manually manage any replication. However, now you can give it multiple paths in there, in the bit that says replicate user stores, and have it write to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as many as you want, different stores, right? It's great. And this applies to file-based settings, container-based settings, or both, right? It's absolutely great. So you can already see there's options for resilience and failover here. You can flip the policies around, you can spin up machines in a different data center, and a data center goes down and pull their profiles in from the copies. We've put it through quite a bit of rigorous testing. It's worked really well so far. We're very impressed. And if you're using containers as well, you can even use the replication to replicate the containers to a different file store path than the file-based profiles, which is neat. Again, common factor with UPM, there's lots of different ways you can skin it to meet your needs. There's also, in 2303, so a brand new feature, and this was a feature that we actually requested, is your synchronization and replication options, right? So in its default configuration, UPM, whether this be container-based or file-based, only does the synchronization and the replication when the user logs out. Now, for a very long time, you've had two settings called active write-back and active write-back registry, which synchronizes file system and registry settings in session. But this generated a lot of noise, so it's introduced like the replication to be done every 5 minutes with a random offset to reduce the load. But in big, busy environments, this is still quite a hit in the file server. And in environments like mine, where the users never ever log off, this left us in a bit of a catch-22 situation as how to get the replication done. But now we have an addendum to the active write-back policies, which is called sync at session lock or disconnect, right? So if you look at this picture here, during the user session, it will synchronize to one or many profile stores when the user logs off, when the session is locked or when the session is disconnected, and that is ideal for my needs. And because when I use a locked machine, they're usually going to be away for a while, so that's the ideal time for them to synchronize it back to the file store. Really, really good controls that Citrix have added in there. That's a great feature in version 2303. It also has in 2209 or later has the ability to do deduplication, right? So I was a little bit skeptical about this at first. I thought, how many duplicate files could there be in the profile of each user? But I know someone who deployed this. I haven't gone and deployed it yet, and they saved around 52% of the capacity on the file share, which was astounding. So you simply configure this, and users, instead of writing all of their files to each of their individual configured directories in the store, there's a shared file store directory that shares the files that are replicated across all users, right? I haven't tested what this would be like if the file share went offline, but if the numbers that are there, the saving that you make is the reality, that'll be a really great feature. What I think would be great is if they added some sort of discovery tool that could look at your UPM file stores and tell you how much space you could potentially save. So that would be another great addition to go on top of the deduplication feature. Now, what you can do with UPM, if you want to, you can mix file-based settings and you can mix container-based settings, right? And the diagram at the bottom of this slide here basically shows what I did. I was using file-based UPM, so most of the user's profile was done via file-based, but certain folders I wanted to save into the VHD to make them perform better. Desktop folder, particularly in this implementation, I'm having problems with. The Outlook OST, which is obviously a common one that people do, and the Google Chrome cache as well. You can, in UPM, just like with FSLogix, do Teams, do OneDrive. It's got OneDrive support now as well. You can do all of that as part of a VHD. But the key thing is with UPM is that you can tell it which folders you want to capture in the VHD. With FSLogix, you're limited to Teams, OneDrive, OneNote, Outlook, search database, the ones that are allowed by the policy. With the Citrix UPM implementation, you'll have all of those and additional folders as well, so you can put as much as you want into the VHD, as much as you want into the file-based side of this. Now the obvious question is, people would say, why wouldn't we just do it all in container, right? Why would we go file-based? But if you look at my next sort of slide here, is you can try and do kind of like a cross-operating system support. However, if you try and do it with lots in the profile and a little bit in file-based, the management of it currently is a bit difficult because you've got to include what you want in the profile, right? So it gets a little bit of a fight. So the use case I had here was to share application settings between the 2012 R2 implementation and the Windows 10 implementation. Use containers for those and have a little bit of file-based settings over the top. Now it looked like the way you can do this, but it looked like it was going to be a bit unmanageable. However, I forgot about another little feature that UPM has and has had for a while. It's called cross-operating system support, which basically lets you leverage Microsoft's UEV engine to save specific application settings into UPM file shares and then sprinkle them across the top. Now, this is not the ideal way of doing it because we're leveraging UEV through UPM, right? But I think until Citrix come up with an easier to manage way of combining a lot of profile and a small amount of files together, then this is probably the easiest way to do it. However, I hope in the future, because it's easy at the minute in UPM to do a lot of file-based and a little bit of container, but doing a lot of container and a little bit of file-based, you have to use UEV. So I think, a feature request from Citrix, if they could flip that around a bit and give us the capability to do a lot or a little on either side, then that would make things much easier for the cross-operating system support. But for right now, you can do it using the cross-operating system support functionality, which, as I said, leverages UEV under the hood, so I expect to be messing about with XML files a little bit. However, another really great feature is asynchronous GPO support. Right, it used to be in FSLogix and then they broke it and apparently it's not coming back, but it's now in UPM now. Now if you don't know what I'm talking about, your user group policy processing, which happens when you log in, is done much faster if it's running what's called asynchronous mode, right? Which simply allows the shell to start before it's finished, which means your logon's much faster. Now the setting that indicated your next logon could be asynchronous used to sit in HK current user, but then moved to HKLM, right? So to roam this setting, you need to capture that SID key and inject it back in. UPM can now do it, so this is a great feature for those of us who need fast logons. At the minute, UPM is the only profile management tool I know that can do it. There's a couple of GPOs that you need to set. If you go on my blog and look up asynchronous processing modes, it'll tell you how to get that in there. However, UPM can also integrate with FSLogix if you want to. I know I've been banging and bashing at FSLogix, but If you want to make FSLogix handle concurrent sessions better, and this is cool, right, because a lot of us are heavily invested in FSLogix and change is sometimes hard to do. Now, concurrent sessions is one of the bits that FSLogix isn't great at, right? It can handle it, but it feels slow and clunky with diff disks and merges, right? But if you turn on the UPM and FSLogix integration, UPM just sits there in the background like a silent partner, unless it detects that when the user logs on, that the FSLogix profile is already running with a mounted profile. Now, if that happens, it spins up a UPM-based profile, and when that session ends, it merges the file-based profile and any changes back into the FSLogix HDX. I think the ideal use case for this is people who have FSLogix maybe for a desktop session for their main profile, right? And then running published apps from the desktop afterwards. Although you could apply it to pure published apps as well. What it does do is improve the speed of multiple sessions and avoids using lots of storage just to support what could be a small number of changes from the secondary session. So it's another really cool feature for people who are committed to FSLogix but just want to improve how it handles multiple sessions. Now, FSLogix, as well as doing profile containers, does a thing called app masking, which is another really great feature. Lets you hide or reveal apps based on certain group memberships, process names, OU names, all sorts of filters. We now have a thing in UPM called App Access Control Rules that does exactly that. It works the same way. You've got a web hub tool, a GUI that you can use to scan apps and add the registry keys in, and then simply apply them to groups or whatever you want to apply them to. And a user logs in, they can either say apps or not say apps based around those rules. Things that can be installed on the goal image can be hidden from certain groups if you need them to. So wow, a great addition. You know, FSLogix app masking, app access control rules now does exactly the thing. The one thing it doesn't do yet is redirection rules, which is the only bit of FSLogix's sort of app masking suite that I really love, which is a great bit of tooling. So app access control can replace the app masking, but not the redirection rules. Not yet, anyway. And there's also some enhancements to profile streaming, which lets you, stream files into your session much more easily. You can now do folders as well as just files from 2103 and higher. Great stuff for published app environments when you're trying to ensure that remote applications launch as quickly as possible. So, what is hot, what is not about UPM? It's very configurable, right? I love that. This is an example showing how I skinned it for a particular use case. The functionality you can leverage together for whatever you require. You can include and exclude as required. You can mix container and files. You can layer custom folders into containers. You can put little bits of settings across different operating systems. You can do targeted includes and excludes. You can do built-in migration, do offline support. There are loads of different ways you can skin it, and that's why I think it's ideal for diverse environments. I've got users non-persistent virtual desktops, so use full UPM container. I've got users roaming between, they use a laptop, but occasionally they use a virtual desktop when they're at home, so I just take little bits of that. I've got users with heavy resilience requirements. I use the replication features for that. It's all sorts of things. What's not great about UPM at the minute, it's not documented very well, I'm probably making a rod for my own back here. I'm planning on blogging a few bits of it. You have to dig quite heavily into the Citrix website to understand how parts of the suite work. Often they're not mapped to the use cases. Sometimes the wording that describes how the policies work is a bit ambiguous, and you have to go back to Citrix and ask them questions to help out. Sometimes as well, and this is a bit of a big criticism, the people doing professional services and support for Citrix don't understand how some of the new features can be used. So yeah, great set of functionality in there, but not well documented and not well publicised. One thing that is a big pain though, and I've dedicated its own slide to it, is Microsoft Universal Windows Platform apps are still a terrible pain with UPM. Generally I prefer to remove them all if possible, but some of my users need to use sticky notes, so I have to bring that back. I've managed to get it working okay, but it seems a bit flaky. Sometimes I have to do a little bit of scripting to redeploy the apps. This is the only place where FSLogix, which now has UWP AppX deployment built in, the only place where FSLogix still beats UPM in those stakes. And it's worth mentioning that if you're like me and you're trying to figure out a way in UPM how to save those settings properly, there's a setting called Disable Automatic Configuration. Make sure you turn that on, because otherwise, no matter what includes and excludes that you configure as you're trying to make it work, if the automatic configuration is not disabled, it simply goes and then configures itself in line with Microsoft's best practices, which don't always work. So be very careful to turn that off if you have to do a custom way. Obviously the best way is just get rid of all the UWP apps, but I do appreciate that people can't do that. So hopefully Citrix might add that functionality pretty soon that gives us the way to roam the packages around as well. And just a final mention is, UPM and WEM. I don't do a lot of WEM, but they're very closely integrated now. And I think if they merged UPM and WEM, you can configure UPM through WEM, right? If they merge them much more tightly together, maybe UPM would become a product that, as a suite in itself could almost stand on its own. The WEM product team at Citrix are very good. They're very responsive. They always respond to feature requests, they have a lot of updated codes and private fixes and things like that very quickly. So hopefully, with that being part of the same product group now, we might see a lot more of it. So just in summary, and apologies for talking for so long, what's the key takeaways, right? Don't forget how important the profile is to your UX. They may get more portable in the future, but for now, you've still got to think about them. Make sure you properly understand your profile management requirements, right? I think most enterprises these days would need a hybrid profile type. UPM having container support, it feels better than FS Logics now. It certainly feels more loved than FS Logics. It's not quite as mature, but it is getting much better. Loads of different resilience options. You mix things together with all those different settings to give you the best of both worlds you can do across OS. And I think for Citrix customers, user profile management really has to be a no-brainer for now. However, if you're not a Citrix customer, I can't imagine that you would pay for Citrix licenses just to get UPM, which is why I say if Citrix were to blend UPM and WEM together and produce a standalone product that people could license individually at a sort of a discounted price, then maybe that might be reason to do it. But if you're a Citrix customer, I think UPM makes the most sense in the profile management arena right now. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry to have talked for 31 minutes, but the original presentation was an hour long. Hopefully this is useful to some of you, and we should have some more videos coming up really soon.